Test. So yeah, it looks like I'm good. Okay. I'm Phil Wyman, and this is the Wild Theology Podcast, where the world, the humans in it, and God are all wilder than we've been told.
That's your intro?
So, you'll get philosophy and theology and crazy stories that come from 30 years of pastoring,
Boring.
20 years of festival work,
Whatever.
and the mud and blood of wrestling with the living in the spaces angels fear to tread.
Ooh, trying to sound interesting, are we?
Oh.
Yeah, you think you got something to say?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the problem, dimwit.
Look, I'm a lot smarter than you think.
Yeah, you tightened your shoes this morning.
Whatever. We're Phil Wyman, and this is Wild Theology, where you get to argue with your own ideas.
And lose.
That's the point. In this Wild Theology podcast, we'll look at the subject of Halloween. It's time to argue with ourselves and reconsider what we've been told about this celebration, which has now become the second most popular holiday on the American calendar. You can help support this podcast as well as my ongoing creative endeavors, if that's something you'd like to do, by joining me here on Patreon. By pledging support, you'll only be charged by the episode, whether it's a podcast or a preview into one of the many books I'm in the process of writing. So, back to challenging our assumptions about what we know about Halloween. This episode coincides with the release of my new book, The Reformation of Halloween, Rethinking Christianity's Response to Halloween. Here's what we've been told about this holiday. Today's Halloween is said to be based upon ancient Celtic New Year traditions from Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. It is known as Samhain in Irish and Noson Galan Gaeaf in Welsh. The ancient Celts supposedly honored the dead on this day, and the spirits of those dead were said to be roaming the earth and needed to be placated, and so the Celts sought the help of their gods to restore some kind of order to the world. Encyclopedia Britannica supposedly once said this, quote, "In ancient Britain and Ireland, the Celtic festival of Samhain was observed on October 31st, at the end of summer. The souls of the dead were supposed to visit their homes on this day, and the autumnal festival acquired sinister significance, with ghosts, witches, goblins, black cats, fairies, and demons of all kinds said to be roaming about. It was the time to placate the supernatural powers controlling the processes of nature. In addition, Halloween was thought to be the foremost favorable time for divinations concerning marriage, luck, health, and death. It was the only day on which the help of the devil was invoked for such purposes." Unquote. These words, supposedly coming from the 13th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, are quoted in an article by John Ankerberg from Christian Broadcasting Network. Though my reading of the 13th edition did not find any reference to invoking the help of the devil. More recently, Encyclopedia Britannica has changed the information on Halloween, but some of the same info on the ancient Celts and these wandering spirits remains in the text. Now, what if the information we've been told about Halloween was inaccurate? In fact, what if that information was so inaccurate as to be nearly non-existent? How would that change the way you view Halloween? Problematically, the old encyclopedic reference and the newer one contain information with little to no source reference. That's right. Even that trusted, infallible source we call the encyclopedia is subject to error. This has been the problem with discovering the roots of this day we call Halloween. The so-called experts are merely laying one set of false assumptions upon an older set of false assumptions to come up with a supposed ancient historical context to the modern phenomena we call Halloween. More recent scholarship has begun to challenge the idea that Halloween as we know it today has its roots in ancient Celtic paganism. Steve Roud, the founder of the Roud Folk Song Index and an expert on folklore and superstition, wrote a book on the calendar of celebrations and festival days in the history of England called The English Year, which came out in 2006. In it, he attempts to shake the attachment of today's Halloween to an ancient pagan festival of the dead, but sadly acknowledges the near impossibility of accomplishing the task. He says, quote, "Halloween is probably the most widely misunderstood and misrepresented day in the festival year, but so many now believe that it was originally a pagan festival of the dead that this belief is virtually impossible to shake. The facts, however, are very different and far more elusive and complex." End quote. His study has concluded that not only are there few historical references to occult and religious pagan practices on this day, but that the connection of Halloween to a celebration of the dead is a Christian connection. It was the medieval Christian feast days of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day that solidified October 31st through November 2nd as days connected to death. One day was a remembrance of the saints of the Christian Church, and the other was a Catholic call to pray for our relatives who have died and passed on. Halloween, as we know it today, with trick-or-treating, costuming black cats, witches on broomsticks, and all the assorted horror and fantasy motifs, is a recent development, and its supposed connections to the past are part of the mystique of Halloween. As Steve Roud goes on to say, quote, "Most of the supernatural aura that supposedly surrounded the day in earlier times is an invention from the modern period that has now become entrenched in a way that is depressingly familiar throughout popular writing on folklore." In other words, it's likely that someone has made up an ancient history about Halloween, and we have all taken the bait. Roud goes on to write about the rise of trick-or-treating, which he calls house visiting. Even this is a recent development. In fact, so recent that references of door-to-door visiting on the 31st of October appear in the mid-20th century in Wales and England. So then the very land that this celebration supposedly comes from was apparently way behind the New World. Americans had been trick-or-treating for decades by then. Historian Ronald Hutton is a specialist in early modern British history and folklore, and a foremost authority on the rise of modern neo-paganism and witchcraft, and is a neo-pagan himself. Hutton believes that there is probably more connection between today's Halloween and the ancient Irish Samhain, but even he has to acknowledge that we have almost no information on how they celebrated the 31st of October. As he says, quote, "As such, it was one of the greatest religious festivals of the ancient northern pagan year, and the obvious question is what rites were celebrated then? The answer to that is that we have virtually no idea, because northern European pagans were illiterate and no record remains of their ceremonies." This invention of a history of Halloween and the assumption that 20th century door knocking has an ancient source in Irish and Welsh history is part of an overall movement to find roots for Christian actions in ancient paganism. Halloween has been the victim of a trend in reading Christian history. It is commonly assumed that Christian traditions, festivals, and beliefs are adaptations from previous pagan traditions, festivals, and beliefs. So people will say that the story of Jesus rising from the dead is not an actual historical event. We stole the story from the ancient pagans. The Babylonian Assyrian Bel Marduk story includes rising from the dead. In this way, the Christian history of Christ's resurrection is assumed to be a false history, and the real basis for the story is a rip-off from another source. The difficulty with this is that a God who dies and rises each year in connection with the cycles of the season is assumed to be the source material for the Jesus story, which is a once-and-for-all conquering of death. This is only one example of creating a history of Christianity that assumes that ancient pagan religions had the ideas first, and Christians merely stole those ideas. The connection from Bel Marduk to Christ's resurrection is a frail connection. The connection from ancient Irish Druids to children trick-or-treating in Salem, Massachusetts in 2018 is even less likely to be based in any kind of fact. This story of Samhain is shrouded in the mystery of history and likely has no connection whatsoever to Halloween. Now, here's the problem with this history of Halloween, as we have been taught it today. We have been given a set of presumptions and have passed them on as facts. This was particularly prevalent in the 1980s when pastors and preachers spread the word that Halloween was an ancient demonic celebration and Christians should stay away from it. And here's the real takeaway. If we don't know what truly happened in ancient Ireland and Wales with the Druids and their Samhain and Noson Galangaev gatherings, how are we to trust those who tell us that ancient pagans did terrible things on Halloween and that our participation in Halloween is evil because it is connected to this ancient pagan practice? Seems wise to me, assuming that we know so little about the ancient history of Halloween, that we cannot presumptuously say that Halloween in America is based upon ancient pagan celebrations with sacrifices to false gods. To accuse parents who are taking their kids trick-or-treating for Halloween of being practitioners of some ancient pagan ritual is outright audacious. So next time somebody talks to you about Halloween, just remember, you have the freedom to celebrate Halloween how you choose. Do you enjoy the pumpkin carving, the scary stories, the community interaction, and the costuming of the season? Celebrate. Or do you feel like it's just another capitalistic trap that is just one more way to separate a fool from his money? Well, then don't celebrate it. Whatever you do, don't allow urban myth and unfounded fears based in conspiratorial presumptions about ancient history become the reason for your actions. To base your life on a set of false assumptions is to live by a lie. The text for this podcast is attached to the Patreon page. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to find out more about how Christians might be able to rethink their engagement with this popular holiday, you can discover more in my new book, The Reformation of Halloween. You can find it on Amazon.com. Thanks. Thank you to David Gerard for his ambient music. What you heard today was 12:48 a.m. Black Rock, and you can find more of his music at bandcamp.ambientism.com. If you'd like to support this project, you can do so here on Patreon for as little as $1 a release, and at the most, that's $4 a month.
Why on earth would anybody want to support us?
Well, I think we're pretty cool, and maybe some people believe in what we're doing.
Oh, come on, you believe that?
Yeah.
Don't you ever think you're just a little too weird for the average person?
Yeah, sometimes.